On Friday, January 10th, 2003, 85-year-old Anna Mae Branson was standing in her bedroom closet on the second floor of her large home in Madisonville, Kentucky. Madisonville was a peaceful coal mining town that residents had nicknamed the best town on earth. Anna Mae was trying to pick out the perfect outfit to wear to a dance that she was going to the following night with her new fiancé, and she eyed a long black cape with a leopard print collar hanging in the closet, and she smiled. Anna Mae loved clothes, and at 85 years old, she still enjoyed getting all dressed up. So almost every time she left the house, she wore high heels, a huge sparkling diamond ring, and a perfectly styled wig. In fact, Anna Mae had built a reputation in town for dressing like a movie star for decades, and she wasn't about to give that up now just because some people saw her as an old lady. But Anna Mae had not always worn fancy clothes and expensive diamonds. She was born in Madisonville in 1917, the oldest of 5 siblings, and she had a pretty traditional upbringing that involved going to church regularly and helping her parents look after her younger siblings. And most people in town had made their living from working in the Kentucky coal mines or from running farms. But as Anna Mae grew up, she had discovered she was great with numbers and with money. And so at a time when there weren't a lot of career opportunities for women, she had dreamed of starting her own business someday. So after she had graduated high school and gotten married, she and her husband worked several different jobs and put away as much money as they could for the future. And then in 1950, when they'd saved up enough, they bought a Dairy Queen franchise and then opened the first fast food restaurant in Madisonville. And it turned out Madisonville loved Dairy Queen. And soon, Anna Mae and her husband's restaurant was the busiest place in town, and they were bringing in more money than they had ever imagined. Anna Mae and her husband had run the Dairy Queen successfully for 40 years, and over that long period of time, they had become 2 of the most well-known and beloved people in all of Madisonville. But then, in 1994, Anna Mae's husband passed away, and she didn't want to run the restaurant without him, so she had sold the Dairy Queen and walked away a millionaire. At the time, most of her family had assumed Anna Mae would retire, but she loved working and feeling like she was part of the community, so she had taken a chunk of the money she'd made from selling the Dairy Queen and invested it in rental homes and other real estate properties in the area. And so by now, she had been running her own real estate business for almost 10 years and had made a ton more money in the process. And she had no intention of retiring anytime soon. Back in the closet, Anna Mae walked over to the shelves that held her large shoe collection. But before she could decide which pair of high heels she should wear to the following night's dance, she heard the phone ring in the bedroom. So she stepped out of the closet, walked across her room, and grabbed the phone on the bedside table. And right away, as she listened to the voice on the other line, a very concerned look came across her face. There was a man yelling at her on the other line, and Anna Mae could not figure out what he was even saying. She asked the man to calm down and to please speak lower, but the man shouted that Anna Mae needed to come to his house as soon as she could. And Anna Mae finally recognized the voice. It was Robert Prince, a man who rented a house from her. So she asked Robert, what's wrong? What's going on here? How can I help? Then Robert got really quiet, and in almost a whisper, he said there were ghosts in his attic, and that Anna Mae had to come get the ghosts out of there. Then Robert hung up on the other line, and Anna Mae stood there in her bedroom with a stunned look on her face. She hung up the phone and sat down on her bed. Robert had always been a little weird and eccentric since he'd moved into one of her properties, but saying he saw ghosts in the attic was strange, even for him, and Anna Mae didn't know how to handle it. She worried if she called the police about this, Robert might get in some kind of trouble, and she didn't want that. So she decided she would call to check in on him over the weekend and then maybe pay him a visit on Monday if she needed to. Anna Mae took a deep breath and collected herself, but then a sudden knock at the front door startled her. And she laughed because she wondered if maybe one of her other renters was also coming to tell her that they had ghosts in their house too. So Anna Mae got up and headed downstairs, and when she opened the front door, a grin came across her face. Because it was not a renter scared of ghosts, it was her nephew, Russell Winstead. Russell smiled and gave his aunt a big hug. He was 37 years old, 6 foot 1 inches tall, and his brown hair was just starting to turn a little gray. Anna Mae's younger brothers and sisters all had children, so Anna Mae had a bunch of nieces and nephews, and all of those nieces and nephews said Anna Mae was like a second mom to them. And so, as Anna Mae had gotten older, the ones who still lived in Madisonville made it a point to stop by regularly to check on her and to make sure she wasn't alone too often in her big house. Anna Mae and Russell walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. And right away, Russell asked her how the real estate business was going. And Anna Mae just laughed and then told him about how Robert Prince, one of her renters, had actually just called and said there were ghosts in his attic, and so that was basically how the real estate business was going. But while Anna Mae laughed, Russell didn't. He did not think it was funny at all. He said it sounded like the guy was seriously disturbed, and he told Anna Mae not to go over to the house to see Robert by herself. He said if she really needed to see him, she should call him, Russell, or his dad, who was Anna Mae's youngest brother, and they would go with her. Anna Mae thanked Russell, but told him that really everything was fine, Robert Prince was harmless, and then she quickly changed the subject and asked how things were going with him. Russell filled her in on what his wife and kids were up to and said they'd all see her at church on Sunday night, and then he also talked a little bit about how his work as a mining engineer was going. And then, after they talked a little while longer, Russell said he better get home for dinner, so he stood up, gave his aunt another big hug, and walked out. Once Russell was gone, Anna Mae headed back upstairs into her closet to settle on an outfit for the big dance she was going to the next day. And then, later that night, as she got ready for bed, she thought again about that phone call from Robert, and suddenly it really wasn't funny to her. Much like Russell, she did think that, maybe something was wrong with Robert. Maybe he really was disturbed, and that she needed to be really careful with him and not be alone with him. But by the following night, Saturday night, Anna Mae had put Robert and the ghosts in his attic out of her mind because she was having the best time she'd had in months, dancing with her new fiancé in an outfit that made her look like a movie star. The next day, on Sunday, January 12th, so 2 days after Anna Mae got that call about ghosts from Robert Prince, she was attending evening services at the church that was right across the street from her house. And at around 7 p.m., the service ended, and Anna Mae went to the lobby to say hi to some of her friends. And as she was there, her nephew Russell, who had visited her a couple days earlier, along with his wife and their kids, came over to talk to her for a bit. A little while later, Anna Mae said goodnight to everyone, stepped outside, and walked across the street to her house. She was wearing a sweater, her diamond ring, and one of her capes. When she got home, Anna Mae walked through the living room and back to the kitchen. She took off her cape and draped it over a kitchen chair. Then she made herself some soup and sat down to eat. But at 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after she'd begun eating, there was a loud knock at the front door. Now, visitors often stopped by to see Anna Mae after church, so she didn't think anything out of the ordinary was going on. So she walked to the front of the house, she opened the door, smiled, and said hello to the visitor standing there. Then the visitor stepped inside, but Anna Mae didn't notice that they were hiding something behind their back. The visitor then took a deep breath and then told Anna Mae that they really needed her help, big time. But after hearing what they wanted, Anna Mae shook her head and said she would not do what the visitor was asking her to do. And then suddenly the visitor's face turned red and they started shouting at Anna Mae. A look of fear crossed Anna Mae's face and she took a few steps back, but the visitor moved in closer to her, shouting even louder and showing her what they had hiding behind their back. It was a 2-foot, 1/2-inch metal breaker bar, which is like a large socket wrench used to tighten or loosen rusted bolts. The visitor held the breaker bar above their head, and Anna Mae screamed. She held up her hands and tried to get the visitor to calm down, but they just kept on shouting. So Anna Mae finally turned around and moved as fast as she could through the living room, and then she rushed down a long hallway to a door that led into the basement. Anna Mae reached out, and the doorknob rattled in her shaking hands, but she flung the door open, slammed it behind her, and started down the stairs into the basement away from this person. But when she reached the bottom, she heard the door to the basement open again, and she turned back, looked up the stairs, and saw standing there was this person, breaker bar in hand over their head, and a second later they were charging down the stairs after her. At around 11:30 a.m. on the following morning, Anna Mae's new fiancé stepped out of his car and walked up to the front door of Anna Mae's house. He was there to pick her up for a lunch date they had planned. Anna Mae's fiancé was a retired doctor in his late 80s, and he never thought he would get married again so late in life. But when he had met Anna Mae, he'd fallen in love with her right away, and so he decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left with her, and he had proposed, and Anna Mae had said yes. The fiancé knocked on the door and waited, but Anna Mae didn't answer, so he knocked again, and then he rang the doorbell. But still, there was nothing. So he leaned in close to the door to try to hear if there was any movement inside, but the house was quiet. And when a couple more minutes had passed with still no Anna Mae, he really started to worry. So he walked away from the house and went across the street to the church. He walked into the church lobby and stepped into a small office where a woman was sitting behind a desk, and he said he was worried something was wrong with Anna Mae, and he asked the woman to call 911 and then to please call Anna Mae's brother, Earl. The woman knew Anna Mae and her family very well, and she said she would take care of it. The fiancé thanked her, and then quickly he rushed out of the church and walked back across the street to Anna Mae's house. And in a matter of minutes, an officer from the Madisonville Police Department and Anna Mae's brother, Earl, pulled up in front of the house. Earl and the officer stepped out of their cars and headed towards the front door. Earl was 67 years old, 18 years younger than his sister, and like his son Russell, he had made it a habit to check on Anna Mae whenever he could. Earl said hello to the officer and the fiancé, and then walked right to a small bush by the porch. He crouched down and grabbed the spare key he knew Anna Mae kept hidden under that bush. Then, with the key, he unlocked the door and let the officer and Anna Mae's fiancé inside. Once inside, all three men started calling out for Anna Mae, but they got no response, so they split up. The officer headed upstairs, the fiancé went to the kitchen, and Earl walked through the living room. They were all concerned Anna Mae had possibly fallen and maybe been knocked unconscious, and Earl was worried that the fall could have taken place sometime the night before, and so she might have been out cold or injured for a long time. Earl called out for his sister again, but he still didn't get a response. So he walked down the hall to the basement door. Then he opened the door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. But when he got halfway down the stairs and looked at the floor below him, he screamed. Earl shook his head and he hoped that what he was looking at was some kind of nightmare or hallucination, but it was real, and he couldn't believe it. Anna Mae's body was lying on a rug on the basement floor. She was covered in blood, and her sweater and the shirt she'd been wearing under it were torn to shreds. Earl didn't know what had happened, but he knew this was not the result of a fall. Earl rushed down the rest of the stairs and stood over his sister's broken body. Tears started running down his cheeks, and he felt like he'd gotten the wind knocked out of him. Anna Mae had been about 18 when Earl was born, and she had always been protective of her youngest brother. And even when Earl was an adult with children of his own, Anna Mae had always looked out for Earl's family and helped them in any way she could. In the basement, Earl heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up and saw Anna Mae's fiancé and the police officer, and when the fiancé saw Anna Mae on the floor, he broke down in tears just like Earl. But the police officer just stood there in shock. It had been 20 years since the last major homicide case had happened in Madisonville, and that was a long time before he, and a lot of people on Madisonville's small police force, had started their careers in law enforcement. The officer quickly called into the police station for backup, and he contacted the county sheriff's department. But he was pretty sure that even the county officers had not seen anything like this before. A few minutes after the call went out to the police and the sheriff's departments, Officer Kelly Rager of the Madisonville Police parked her cruiser in front of Anna Mae's house. She stepped outside and right away felt a chill run through her body. Winter temperatures had dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it wasn't the weather Rager was feeling. She was shaken because she knew the woman who had lived in this large two-story house. Officer Rager's mom and Anna Mae had been friends for years, and like so many people in Madisonville, Rager had looked up to Anna Mae, and she thought Anna Mae was an inspiration to people, and especially to women who wanted to pursue a career that some others thought women had no business doing. Officer Rager walked towards the front door and heard a car screech to a stop behind her. She turned around and saw Detective Scott Troutman from the Hopkins County Sheriff's Department step out of his car and walk towards her. The two young investigators greeted each other and talked briefly. They both knew they were coming to the scene of a homicide. And even though Troutman did not have a personal connection to the victim like Rager did, he knew how well loved Anna Mae and her family were throughout the area. So Troutman understood that this case was going to affect the entire community. The investigators walked into the house together and saw Earl and Anna Mae's fiancé sitting in the living room with the first officer who had arrived on the scene. All three of them looked like they were still in shock. Detective Troutman crossed over to Earl and the fiancé and told them how sorry he was, and then he asked if they wouldn't mind walking him through what had happened earlier that morning. And they both gave him an account of how they'd gotten to the house and how they'd found Anna Mae's body in the basement. Troutman thanked them for their time and told them investigators would follow up with them soon. Then he and Rager headed to the basement. Anna Mae had converted the basement almost into a small apartment. There was a living room with a comfortable couch, a bathroom with a shower in it, a washer and a dryer, and a small refrigerator and freezer. And when the investigators stepped into that basement, they saw Anna Mae lying face down on a rug in front of the couch. But something immediately stood out to both of them. There was a pool of blood around Anna Mae's body, but other than that, the basement looked totally clean. There was no blood spatter on the walls, the floor, or the stairs. The investigators knew they would have to do a thorough search of the basement, but at first glance, it looked like whoever had killed Anna Mae had taken the time to wipe down the entire crime scene. Detective Troutman did a walkthrough of the basement while Officer Rager crouched down on the floor next to Anna Mae's body to look more closely at the wounds. It was hard for her to concentrate because she couldn't understand how any human being could do something like this to a defenseless 85-year-old woman. But she took a deep breath and tried to leave her personal feelings aside and focused on finding evidence. And one of the first things she noticed was that Anna Mae was still wearing her large, expensive diamond ring. To Rager, this all but ruled out the murder being the result of a robbery. Because why would a robber leave behind such an obvious, expensive piece of jewelry? Then Troutman called Rager over to him. He was down on one knee, leaning in close to the small freezer that was pushed up against one of the walls. So Rager stood up and walked away from the body. Then she crouched down too, next to Troutman, and he pointed out 2 streaks of blood on the freezer. The only blood he'd found in the basement other than the blood right around Anna Mae. And Troutman told Rager that he thought there was something interesting about these streaks of blood. The streaks looked entirely different from each other. Troutman was not a blood spatter expert, but his first thought was that the 2 patterns had been made by 2 different weapons. And the idea that the killer took the time to use 2 separate weapons made him think they must have really wanted to inflict as much pain as possible, or that they had had a mental break and had gone into some kind of frenzied attack. And then, not long after the discovery of these unique blood streaks on the freezer, forensics experts from the county arrived, and they confirmed Troutman's hunch. They said 2 weapons had been used in the attack on Anna Mae. And they also confirmed that someone had cleaned the crime scene, but must have just missed the marks on the freezer. And so while the forensics team did a thorough investigation of the basement and the body, Troutman and Rager went outside and interviewed neighbors to find out if anybody had seen anything out of the ordinary that morning or the night before. But the only information they got was that one neighbor thought she might have seen a truck parked in front of Anna Mae's house on Sunday night, but she couldn't remember the make and model of the truck, so by the time the investigators left the scene later that day, they really did not have much to go on. They considered the possibility that Anna Mae's fiancé might have committed the murder because the violence of the attack could indicate a crime of passion. But her fiancé was an old man who was not in the best health, and they had a hard time believing he had the strength to carry out the kind of attack that had taken place in the basement. So they knew they had to start looking for other potential suspects. So later that evening, several hours after the 911 call, investigators met with different members of Anna Mae's family, and several family members said they knew who police needed to talk to. Robert Prince, the man who rented a house from Anna Mae and recently claimed there were ghosts in his attic that Anna Mae was responsible for. With information about Robert Prince coming from Anna Mae's family, investigators focused their attention on him. And as they dug into his past, he quickly became their primary suspect. Police discovered that multiple people had filed assault charges against Robert, and some people who knew him said he had violent tendencies. It also turned out that Robert drove a truck that could fit the description of the truck Anna Mae's neighbor had claimed to have seen outside of her house on the night of the murder. And then investigators got a piece of bizarre news that made Robert look even more guilty. One of Anna Mae's nieces told police that on the afternoon of January 12th, just a few hours before Anna Mae was believed to have been murdered, Robert Prince had come to the niece's house. And when she had opened the door, he was holding a DVD player, and he said he had to sell the DVD player because he needed some fast cash so he could get out of town. The niece was not interested in buying this DVD player, and so she had sent Robert away, and she hadn't really thought much about it. But when she learned he was a suspect in her aunt's murder case, she wished she had said something to the police right after Robert had showed up at her door. So at this point, investigators believed they had more than enough to bring Robert in for questioning and to get a search warrant for his house. Now, the initial search of Robert's house did not turn up any evidence linking him to the murder, but investigators still saw him as their primary suspect. And so, a couple of days after the murder, Robert arrived at the police station for questioning. And from the moment he walked inside, he was on edge. He talked almost nonstop as he followed an officer into a small interrogation room where Detective Troutman was waiting. In the interrogation room, Robert sat down at a wooden table across from Troutman, and right away, Robert's eyes began darting left and right, left and right. Robert had long brown hair and a large, thick beard. But what stood out to Troutman immediately was that Robert's right arm was in a sling. Troutman sat quietly for a minute and watched Robert shifting in his chair and looking over his shoulder. Then Troutman asked Robert if he was right or left-handed, and Robert said he was right-handed. Troutman did not let his face give anything away, but he wondered if maybe Robert had injured his right arm while attacking Anna Mae, and that was why it was in a sling. Then Troutman leaned in and asked Robert about his past assault charges, but Robert got really angry and said he would not talk about any of them. So, in a calm voice, Troutman said that was fine, and he did his best to get Robert to relax. And then he asked Robert to talk about where he had been on the day Anna Mae had been killed. Robert shifted some more in his chair and then started tapping his left hand on the table. Troutman just kept looking at him, patiently waiting for him to respond. And finally, Robert did. He said he had been traveling to Tennessee that day, so he'd been out of the state. Troutman nodded and then asked if Robert had any proof of this trip. Robert tapped on the table even louder and looked around the room some more. Then he faced Troutman and he said he'd stopped at a convenience store in a small town in Tennessee and that someone from that store might remember him. Troutman knew Robert was acting very strange and suspicious, but the detective was not ready to totally condemn the man just because of odd behavior in an interrogation room, a place where lots of people, guilty and innocent, can act very strange. Troutman knew it would take some time, but he was confident he could track down that convenience store Robert had mentioned in Tennessee and find out if anyone had seen Robert there on the day of Anna Mae's murder. And so, for the time, police would keep Robert at the top of their suspect list, but they didn't have enough evidence to actually hold him. So they told him not to leave town, but he was allowed to go. And over the next few days, while they looked into Robert's alibi, investigators tried to expand their suspect list. But even though the investigation was really just getting started, Anna Mae's family was already worried that law enforcement was not moving fast enough. On Friday, January 17th, 4 days after Anna Mae's body had been discovered, friends and family attended Anna Mae's wake, and the wake gave them all a chance to share stories about how much Anna Mae had meant to all of them. And after the wake, Anna Mae's brothers and sisters and their kids went to Earl's house. They sat together in the living room and talked about some of their favorite memories of Anna Mae. None of them could believe what had happened. And even though she had been 85 years old, they talked about how they'd always thought she would just live forever. And she had been so full of life and energy that they couldn't imagine what their family and what the town would be like without her. But as much as they wanted to focus on Anna Mae's life, they couldn't help but start to talk about the murder investigation. Many of them believed Robert Prince was the most logical suspect. But talking about Robert led to a discussion of all the other people who rented homes and properties from Anna Mae, and they started to wonder if the killer could just be anyone who might have gotten behind on rental payments. And if the list of suspects really was that long, the family worried that the local police and sheriff's department were not up to the task in front of them. And over the course of the week, no new information came in, and police still didn't have any evidence that would actually link Robert to the murder. So Anna Mae's family started to fear that maybe they had been right about the police, and they hated the idea that Anna Mae's killer was still walking free. And so some members of Anna Mae's family started to voice their opinions publicly, and soon the rest of the town joined them in putting pressure on investigators to solve this case. After all, a place that called itself the best town on earth, like Madisonville, couldn't have the brutal murder of one of its most prominent citizens just hanging over it. And things only got worse for investigators when wild rumors started to spread that there was a serial killer roaming the streets of Madisonville and that anyone could be their next victim and anyone could be the killer. Detective Troutman, Officer Rager, and the rest of the investigative team felt the tension growing in town. They'd only been working the case for about a week, but they were already getting loads of calls from residents day in and day out. Some of the calls were from people who thought they might have information that could help. But a lot of the other calls were just people demanding to know what police were doing to solve the murder and to make their town safe again. And so, as they tried to push the investigation forward and keep the town residents calm, Detective Troutman and Officer Rager both began to have a thought that they couldn't shake. They believed the extreme violence of this crime suggested the attack on Anna Mae had to have been personal, and they were almost certain that there had to be some piece of evidence connecting Anna Mae to her killer somewhere in her house. They just needed to find it. In late January, so over a week after the murder, Officer Rager returned to Anna Mae's house. The investigative team and forensics experts had searched the entire house and had combed the basement for evidence multiple times, but Rager believed there was a chance they had overlooked something in the large house. So she stepped inside, walked through the living room, and headed upstairs. And even though the house was still filled with all of Anna Mae's belongings, it felt cold and empty. On the second floor of the house, she walked down a hall towards Anna Mae's bedroom, and as she moved, the hardwood floors creaked under her feet. Then she stepped into the bedroom and went into the closet. She smiled when she saw all of Anna Mae's eccentric and luxurious clothes and shoes, but nothing else inside the closet stood out to her, so she stepped back into the bedroom and walked over to a small wooden desk in the corner. The desk had stationery, pens, and a few papers on it, but nothing that looked like it could help. Then Rager opened a desk drawer, and it was filled with loose papers and a book that looked like a journal. She pulled out the book, flipped it open, and immediately a look came across her face like she had just discovered buried treasure. This journal was a business ledger, and inside it, Anna Mae had kept detailed records of everyone who owed her money, from how much they owed and how much they had paid towards their debt. Rager knew something like this could change the course of the investigation. So she slipped the ledger into an evidence bag and then headed back downstairs and out to her car. And soon after, she met up with Detective Troutman and the rest of the investigative team, and they looked at this ledger, and they were all stunned by how many people had owed Anna Mae money. But as they looked further into the ledger, they would discover something that would bring the investigation into focus. And that discovery would soon make it clear to them who had killed Anna Mae. Based on information inside of that ledger, evidence at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Mae Branson in her home on Sunday, January 12, 2003. At about 7:15 p.m., Anna Mae's killer parked their pickup truck in Anna Mae's driveway, and then they sat there for a minute with the engine running. They stared out the windshield at the front door of the house and tried to tell themselves they were just there to get help, and that if Anna Mae agreed to help them, nothing bad would happen. The killer turned off the engine, reached over to the passenger seat floorboard, and grabbed the 2-foot metal braking bar that was propped up against the seat. Then they got out of the truck, hid the braking bar behind their back, and stepped onto the raised porch in front of the house. Then the killer glanced down at a large bone-handled knife tucked into a sheath on their belt. Then they took a breath and knocked on the door. Soon after, the door opened and the killer saw Anna Mae smiling back at them. The killer smiled, stepped inside, and tried to make sure Anna Mae could not see they were hiding something behind their back. Then the killer looked Anna Mae right in the eye and said they were in trouble and that she was the only one who could help them. But Anna Mae did not want to hear it, and she said she did not want to help. So the killer started yelling at her and said she had to do what they were asking, but Anna Mae started backing away and told the killer to leave. So the killer screamed that they just needed help, but Anna Mae kept shouting right back that they just needed to leave. And the killer's head started pounding, and Anna Mae's voice was making the pain worse, so the killer finally pulled out the breaker bar from behind their back and held it over their head in a threatening manner. Anna Mae saw it and screamed and turned and started rushing across the living room. The killer tried to catch their breath and stop their head from pounding. Then they grabbed the braking bar tighter and chased after Anna Mae. The killer saw her go down the hall, fling open the basement door, and close it behind her. So the killer rushed down the hall, opened up the door again, and saw Anna Mae at the bottom of the basement stairs. But the killer moved fast and caught Anna Mae as she stepped onto the rug in front of the basement couch. And once they caught her, they slammed the braking bar into the back of Anna Mae's head, and Anna Mae's body crumpled onto the rug, and blood began to run down the back of her head. Then the killer tossed the breaking bar to the floor and stood over Anna Mae. The killer couldn't believe Anna Mae had not been willing to just do what they had asked. The killer's whole body started shaking and they clenched their teeth. Then, almost unconsciously, they reached down and unsheathed the bone-handled knife on their belt, and then they crouched down above Anna Mae. The killer grabbed her by the hair and slashed the knife across her throat. Then the killer raised the knife up and began screaming and driving the knife over and over and over again into Anna Mae's back. Even though Anna Mae wasn't moving, the killer didn't stop, over and over and over. Finally, the killer stood back up, and they looked down and saw blood all over their clothes and hands and arms. In their rage, they had stabbed Anna Mae 97 times. The killer walked slowly away from Anna Mae's body over to the washer and dryer. There, they stripped off their clothes, put them in the washer, and did a load of laundry. Then they walked into the basement bathroom, started the shower, stepped in, and washed all the blood off. And after the shower, the killer put their clothes into the dryer. Then they searched the basement until they found cleaning supplies and wiped off any drops of blood they had left behind in the bathroom and on the basement floor, walls, and staircase. The killer took their time and remained calm. And when they thought they had wiped the basement clean, they walked back over to the dryer, took their clothes out, and got dressed. But for some reason, once their clothes were back on, the reality of the situation hit them. They saw Anna Mae's body lying on the floor, and all of a sudden they panicked. So the killer grabbed their weapons, stumbled up the stairs, and made their way through the house. Then they opened the front door, squinted to try to see in the dark to make sure nobody was there, and then they ran outside. The killer climbed in their truck, started the engine, threw it in reverse, and peeled out into the street. And then they put the truck in drive and floored it across town until they got home. And at 9:15 p.m., 2 hours after the killer had gone to Anna Mae's house, the killer walked back into their own home and tried to act like nothing had happened and just sat down casually on the couch. Then the killer's wife walked into the room and told him that she and the kids had really enjoyed catching up with his aunt, Anna Mae, that night at church. And the killer said, "Me too." Russell Winstead, Anna Mae's nephew, the one who had come by and been so concerned about Robert Prince and his ghosts, had been the one who murdered his aunt, the woman he said was like a second mom to him. It would turn out the ledger that investigators found in Anna Mae's house showed that over the course of the past year, Russell had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Anna Mae. And that information had led police to investigate Russell's finances, but they didn't just discover that Russell was in significant debt to his aunt. They discovered he was leading a full-blown double life. Unknown to any of Russell's family, including his wife, he had a severe gambling addiction and was having an affair with a casino waitress. And from Russell's financial records and interviews with that waitress, investigators found out that Russell had visited casinos in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois 236 times in the past year, and that he had been known to lose over $30,000 on some of those visits. And when Russell's gambling losses started to affect his family and his everyday life, he had turned to his rich aunt, Anna Mae, for help. But he had told her the money he needed to borrow from her was for mining equipment. But as Russell kept coming back for more and more money, Anna Mae figured out he was lying, and she confronted him. And he admitted to her that he had lost all the money she gave him gambling. But he begged Anna Mae to please just lend him a little bit more so he could cover his mortgage payment so he and his family wouldn't lose their house. And he promised Anna Mae that he would pay her back. And then on that Friday before the murder, when Russell came over to talk to Anna Mae and they began talking about Robert Prince and the ghosts, Russell had given Anna Mae a check for $12,000 to prove that he was on his way to paying her back in full. But it turned out that Russell didn't actually have the money to cover the check he had written her. Instead, he went to a casino that night to try to win that money. But he ended up losing thousands of dollars instead. And so, on the night of January 12th, Russell drove to church separately from his wife and kids. And after the service, they all said hello to Anna Mae and caught up with her. And then Russell's wife drove home with the kids, and Russell got into his own truck and began driving around town, wondering what he was going to do. He had his braking bar that he used in the mines in the truck with him, along with his knife on his belt. And so he came up with this plan where he would ask Anna Mae to give him back the $12,000 check he'd written so she couldn't deposit it, and if she didn't give the check to him, he would threaten her with the weapons to make her do it. But things had not gone according to that plan. And when Russell arrived at his aunt's house with his breaker behind his back and his knife on his hip and demanded his aunt give him back the check that he had written her, Anna Mae said no, and she told him she was going to tell Russell's wife about his gambling problem and about all the money she had loaned him that he had lost gambling. And when Russell heard that, he flew into a blind rage, and he chased Anna Mae down into the basement and attacked her so violently that the majority of the wounds she suffered were inflicted after she was already dead. It would take months for the investigation to compile all of their evidence against Russell. But in June of 2003, over 4 months after the murder, they were ready to arrest him. But when authorities moved in on Russell's house, they discovered he had fled the country to Costa Rica, and they learned that Russell's father, Earl, was sending money he had inherited from his sister, Anna Mae, the woman Russell had murdered, to financially support Russell in Costa Rica. But with the assistance of Costa Rican authorities, U.S. federal agents were able to track Russell down, and he was arrested in Costa Rica, walking out of a casino. Russell was extradited to the United States, convicted of murder, and given 2 sentences of 25 years to life with a chance for parole in 2049. Earl would plead guilty to hindering apprehension, and he was given 2 years of probation. Anna Mae Branson is buried in Kentucky, and her family and members of the community still visit her grave often, over 20 years after her death. At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And any time she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, they had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers. And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her, she has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people, and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance Sumitra had predicted she would die, on that day Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her. And as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances, and so really the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this. But then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored,
And so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked, and then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to, or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important, for both religious and public health reasons, to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances, they happened all the time for months, but what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, "No, come inside, it's not safe outside." And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her, and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked. Even though for the past 45 minutes, she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, The medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse. He looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family, this is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku, but when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school and so did not know how to write, but now suddenly in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear. And Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong. But Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said. And so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband. And apparently, it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face. And she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over and Sumitra followed him. They sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused. and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry. And then she looked at Ram Tripathi and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born, in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home 60 miles away was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, "Oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital." Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, "Yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her," the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes, he brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second, what Sumitra was saying was, "Papa." In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Duety. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998.
There's a static glow beneath my veins, an ocean folded into glass. I hear the hum, I taste the air. I'm not home, but I'm almost there.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin.